Now, some of you have probably been wondering where we are tonight. Well, tonight we did a little more direct Bible study with small groups. So what they've looked at is they looked at a passage in Judges that is very similar in many ways to the Sodom and Gomorrah story. It gives a little hint of what's actually going on in the Sodom and Gomorrah story, and that's in Judges chapter 19, verses 16 through 25. They've also been doing some studying on Isaiah chapter 1, verses 10 through 17, where the prophet Isaiah offers his interpretation of the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah. And now they're currently looking at Matthew chapter 10, verses 7 through 15, to get a sense of Jesus' interpretation of the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah. And I think as you look at those passages, you'll recognize, and we're going to talk about this as soon as the small groups break, that the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah is not what we've been told many times that it is. And we can get this from the larger biblical context, but we can also get it from the narrative context of Genesis, and that's what we're going to talk about when we break from our small groups. What we're going to mostly focus on tonight is we're going to focus mostly on the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, and we're going to focus some on the near sacrifice or the binding of Isaac. Two challenging stories that we're going to spend some time with. We acknowledge that we don't have a lot of time tonight to spend on a couple of other strange stories, and that was the story of Abraham bargaining with God for human lives, which we will also see Moses do. But it can be a disturbing story because it seems in these stories that it is the human character who has the moral high ground defending lives over against God. That's a disturbing piece. We'll talk about that when we get to the Moses story. And then we also spent a little time talking about Lot and his daughters, and once again Genesis serving as an origin story of how the neighboring tribes came to be. We also acknowledge that probably the Ammonites and the Moabites would not have traced their origins back to an incestuous relationship with Lot and his daughters, like the children of Israel did. But that's the biblical author's version of the story. So that's what we've covered mostly tonight in reading chapters 18 through 23. What we're going to do now is I'm going to start gathering folks together, and we're going to talk a little bit about Sodom and Gomorrah and what we see in Genesis. All right. I know that's not much time, but I hope you had a little bit of an opportunity to see what some of the other biblical authors, how some of the other biblical authors view the Sodom and Gomorrah story. And so it's not necessarily how folks in our contemporary culture explain the Sodom and Gomorrah story, right? Jesus' view of this inhospitality is not the same as what we often hear as the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah. Is it fair to say that? It's fair to say that. So I want to also consider where the story falls in the narrative context of Genesis and what that might tell us. And I would say that the narrative context, where the story appears in Genesis, is really the only way to make sense of this story. I think it's how the author intended his original audience to hear the story and interpret the story. So let's think about this. We have chapter 18 is the previous chapter, obviously. This is in chapter 19. In that story is a story about Abraham and Sarah, and they are at their tent, and three strangers approach their tent. It's clear from the text that they don't know who these men are. They don't know them. They're not their buddies. They're not their friends. They're three people who come. They show up in their yard. And what does Abraham do? So Abraham, he calls his wife and he says, we have to prepare a feast for these three random strangers who have come to our tent. Get your finest flour and grab the fatted calf and bring out your most luxurious butters and foods. We have 3 guests who we don't know. So obviously, let's prepare the finest meal we can. And then Abraham stands by them and makes sure that if they need anything, he's their servant. That's chapter 18. They treat these 3 strangers with the finest ancient hospitality one could ever imagine. And then the visitors decide to go to the next town. They go to Sodom. The story is not the same there. It's the same visitors. Once again, they're coming into an area as outsiders, as strangers, as sojourners. But certainly the story is not the same. So they show up in Sodom, and Lot meets them and says, I need you to stay at my house. And they said, well, we were just planning on sleeping in the town square. That'll be fine. And he says, no, seriously, I need you to stay at my house. Lot knows how people in Sodom treat outsiders. Lot hasn't seen how people are going to treat these men. They haven't had the experience. It's not like he watched how people were looking at him. He saw met him at the gate and said, you can't stay here. Because we know what people in this city do to outsiders. So he says, you got to stay at my house. Well, the folks of Sodom come to the house and they say, you got to send out these guests. We saw you brought outsiders into your house. And we intend to rape them in the public square. Right? I mean, that's what the story says. That's what it's saying. They didn't fall in love. It wasn't like love at first sight. We saw your guests and we think we love them. We want to have sex with them. No, they want to take them into the public square outside of Lot's house. And their intention is, we're going to show outsiders how we treat outsiders who come into this village. And we're going to rape them in the middle of the town. Everybody will see it, and they'll know. And then maybe they'll leave, and they'll go tell other their friends, don't be coming around Sodom. This is how we treat people. This is not a story about sex. This is a known practice in the ancient world of how you humiliate people you don't want in your village. You harm them, you abuse them. We see this in the Judges story, right? This is not the only time we see this. We see this in the Judges story. In that story, in the Judges story, very similar story, Lot offers his daughters. We don't have a lot of time to get into that. That's kind of a terrible detail of it. But they're not interested in the daughters. The daughters they live there in the town. They're not interested in them. But in the Judges story, the man brings with him his concubine or his secondary wife, and she's an outsider too. And if they can't show the guy who's in charge, they'll show somebody else who's an outsider. That's fine. So that's one of the things we see from the Judges story. The gender of the guest didn't matter. They had an agenda. It wasn't about having romantic sex with the visitors. What we're going to see here is, I think a lot of us have been told what this story is about. In fact, you can get a pretty clear sense because sometimes folks will call people who are gay sodomites. I think you can guess where that comes from this story. Now, I'll be clear. I'm not telling you tonight how you have to feel about homosexuality or how you have to feel about same-sex marriage or anything else. What I am saying is, this text is not saying that. This text has been used to show God's disapproval of people who are gay and lesbian, that God will judge them. This is not what this text is about, and I hope that's pretty clear for you in your studies. It does not make any statement in this about 2 adults of the same gender falling in love and getting married. You'll notice that that's not in here. But it is a pretty strong condemnation. It certainly is a strong condemnation on rape and rape culture. that was clearly happening at Sodom, it was generally accepted and known by Lot. I know how this community works. They're going to rape these guys. They didn't tell Lot. They didn't come up and say, listen, if you see two guys come to the gate, you should know we're going to rape them. He knew. He knew how the community works, so he knew what was going to happen. That's why before they even enter the city at the gate, he's trying to usher him into his house as quickly as possible. It's a condemnation of rape and rape culture. It also condemns xenophobia and the fear of people who are outsiders. And that's pretty clear in this text too. And it's certainly clear from the way that Jesus interprets it. He's sending his followers out to other communities, and he's saying some of them are not going to treat you very well because you're from outside the village. And I'll tell you, they're better off than Sodom and Gomorrah, who did the same thing. Same idea. It also condemns the unhospitable treatment of folks who are from other areas. So not only the fear, but also the treatment. I think it also makes very clear that God feels strongly about how we treat people who might be outsiders or strangers. Certainly that was part of the point of this text. You don't set the story of Abraham, who's the hero of the story. We know that. He's the patriarch. He's the hero. And he treats strangers in an amazingly over-the-top hospitality. And that is set right beside this next story. They are clearly set beside each other to compare and contrast. This is how it's supposed to be done. This is how it sometimes is done. And it's pretty clear which one God prefers. And so in a way, I think if we look at this is a little of a twisted irony. This text might have something to say to people of faith about how we have treated and how we do treat gays and lesbians in the church. Now, we've used it to justify mistreatment, but if we're really studying the text, I think it's pretty clear, in a pretty ironic twist, we've done kind of the same thing as the folks in Sodom. And so we find the church sometimes committing the same sin, which is inhospitality. I want to take some time to talk about another story that I think is really significant but also really complicated in this section of Genesis, and that's the near sacrifice of Isaac, sometimes called the binding of Isaac. So let's start with something that we know from Genesis, that we've learned in our studies. Isaac, this boy, just like all the people before him, made in the divine image. We'll start out with that. And we also know from Genesis that it's been said over and over again that no one was permitted to shed human blood. We saw that with Cain early in Genesis, right? He shed his brother's blood, was punished by God. It was reiterated after the flood, that after the flood, Noah and his family are told, you do not shed blood. That's the life. Don't do it. And to do so, which was clear, would undo the work of God. That God has been creating and giving life. And the opposite of that was to take life. And so that was condemned. That was to undo the work of God. It was to be a part of the unraveling of creation. So we've seen that. And now we have this story. Yeah, that's complicated, right? So in this story, God says to Abraham, take your son and kill him. Everything we've seen in Genesis tells us that this is not the way things are supposed to work. So we get this story, which I would suggest is probably the most confusing, most tense, most touching in some ways, emotional, and theologically disturbing story in Genesis. If we're really honest when we're reading the story, it's a little bit of all of those. It's important to know that human sacrifice was practiced in the ancient world. It was not uncommon. And it seems at various times the practice might have been adopted by Israel. So why would I say that? Well, we have some evidence in the Scriptures. And it's worth pointing out that it was always, every time it's mentioned in the Scriptures, it comes with a severe rebuke from God. So the God who tells Abraham, go and sacrifice your son, every time human sacrifice is brought up in the Old Testament, God severely rebukes it. This is going to be a little confusing, this story. You can't tell. So we look at the prophet Jeremiah, who writes in the 7th chapter of the book that bears his name, "For the people of Judah have done evil in my sight, says the Lord. They have set their abominations in the house that is called by my name, defiling it, and they go on building the high place of Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and daughters in the fire, which I did not command, nor did it come into my mind." So in Jeremiah, the prophet's saying, God says, this has never even come into my mind. We have this story from Genesis. And in Deuteronomy, you must not do the same for the Lord your God, because every abhorrent thing that the Lord hates, they have done for their gods. They would even burn their sons and daughters in the fire to their gods. And we have this story from Genesis. In Leviticus, which again forbids the practice of sacrificing children, the children of Israel, to Canaanite gods. Multiple times, God condemns the practice, even the idea of human sacrifice. And we have this passage from Genesis with Abraham and Isaac. So we could say, well, Isaac doesn't get sacrificed. So that's an easy way out of the story, right? You can say that. But before we do that too quickly, God does tell Abraham to make the sacrifice. And in the story, you probably saw this, God commends Abraham's willingness to do it. So that's in the story too. There's a lot at stake in this story. There's a lot threatened. What is threatened in the story is the promise that God made to Abraham. That's threatened. The descendants, this whole idea of this descendants, this great nation, is threatened in this story. The very thing that Abraham and Sarah have waited for their entire lives. And at the birth of Isaac, Abraham is 100 years old. That's threatened in the story. And you might remember that Abraham has already lost one son. Now, Ishmael's not dead, but he's gone. Sarah made it clear, I want that boy out of our household. He was the oldest son. He's gone, no longer a threat for Isaac's inheritance. He's out of the household. So Abraham's down to one son, and it's Isaac. That's threatened. Isaac is Abraham's last shot, and realistically, God's last shot to make good on the promise to Abraham. His wife is 90 years old. The future is at stake in a strange way. So one scholar says God took the risk that Abraham would respond. Abraham took the risk that God would provide. Both of them are taking a risk. So there's a lot that perhaps bothered folks when they're reading this passage, I would think. Is there anybody who was just like, oh, there's no problems here. This is just a good story. This is fine. I don't have any issue with this. I would think, it might not always be the same exact thing that bothered everybody in the room, but I would think that there was something in the story as you're reading it that maybe took you aback, at least. Something. I think if you read it with fresh eyes, or if you had never heard this story before, it's a little shocking. So, tough story if you think of it through from Isaac's perspective, I think. Did anybody try to picture how Isaac might have felt in this story? Yeah, so he's bound like a sacrifice. He watches his father raise a knife above him, right? Ready to, while he's tied to a sacrificial altar. And then he walks back down the mountain, knowing that his father is capable of killing him. That's a tough one to live with. So, the other thing that's challenging about this from Isaac's perspective, is the text gives us no indication that Isaac was in on Abraham's conversation with God. It's pretty clear that the messenger, the angel, is talking to Abraham, right? Going back and forth. We get no sense that Isaac has any idea what's being said. So he's watching all this as Abraham's having some kind of communication with God that he is not a part of. Right. As Jana points out, as they're walking up the mountain, after Abraham and God have already sort of laid out this plan, Isaac's like, hey, so where's the lamb? There's no... Got everything else. I don't see that. Yeah? So here's the thing about this text. I don't have any intention of us solving this text tonight. So folks have been working on this text for thousands of years. It's always been a challenging text. Because of some of the things that I pointed out, there are other places in the Bible that would seem to suggest that this isn't really a possibility, but yet it's in there. But it's not just that I don't know. That's definitely a big part of it. But it's also because I think this text invites us to struggle with it. The writers and editors of Genesis, I mean, if they wanted to make this book easy on us, they could have. They could have started by only giving one version of most of the stories. So I don't think there's any intention of this being easy. I also think it's a good thing as we're studying the Bible, if we're really taking it seriously, to recognize that it's more complex than us just being able to read it through once and figure the whole thing out. Right? We should be able to live with our questions. We should be able to live with our concerns. We should be able to ask the questions and ask the concerns. The original audiences certainly did. And they were more comfortable with that, I think, than we are. We're sort of post-enlightenment. We sort of think that there's going to be a right answer to all these, and we can if we figure out that right answer once, we don't ever have to deal with it again. I guess that's convenient. We shouldn't settle for easy answers, and not now and not ever. So I want to suggest one thing, and then after I'll take some questions, or I'll come over and talk. So it's very possible that rather than just understand this story, that this story is a story that's meant to be felt. So it's interesting, we're not given any insight into the emotions of any of the characters in the story. It doesn't say, Abraham was walking up the hill and his heart was broken and he was weeping because he was grieved so deeply. We don't get any of that. He might have been. I think that's realistic to think that he was. We don't get any sense of that with Isaac. It doesn't say, and Isaac was terrified and horrified and spent the rest of his life in therapy. He might have. But the text doesn't tell us how anybody really feels. It tells us what happened. It doesn't really tell us how it feels. It doesn't say, oh man, God was so relieved when Abraham saw that ram. It doesn't tell us this. We don't get the emotions. But the story is still emotional. So, I don't know how much time we have, but if we have a little bit of time, I would like to give you a chance to talk in your small groups a little bit. But before I do, I want to read to you a very literal translation of this text into English that the scholar, the author, intended to be read out loud to try to capture how the original audience would have heard, not read, most of them were illiterate, would have heard this text. So I'll ask you to listen closely. And after the reading, if we have time, we'll spend a little time talking in small groups about the story. See, these stories are community stories. They were not written by one person to be read by one person. These are stories that were shaped by a community, and they were offered to a community. And so I invite you, after you have a chance to hear the story, to spend some time with the folks at your table and share some of your concerns and some of your struggles, and maybe finally even where you find grace in this story. And it happened after these things that God tested Abraham, and he said to him, "Abraham," and he said, "Here I am." And God said, "Take now your son, your only son, the one you love, Isaac, and go, you, to the land of Moriah, and offer him up as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will tell you." And Abraham rose up early in the morning, and he saddled his donkey, and he took 2 lads with him, and Isaac, his son. And he cut wood for the burnt offering, and he started out for the place that God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place from a distance. And Abraham said to the lads, "Stay here with the donkey, and I and the boy will go over there. We will worship, and we will return to you." And Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and put it on Isaac, his son. And he took in his hands the fire and the knife, and they went on, the 2 of them, together. And Isaac spoke to Abraham his father, and he said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." And he said, "Look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" And Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And they went on, the 2 of them, together. And they came to the place that God told him, and there Abraham built an altar, and he laid out the wood, and he bound Isaac, his son, and he put him on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand, and he took the knife to slaughter his son. And an angel of Yahweh called out to him from the heavens and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." And he said, "Do not stretch out your hand to the lad, and do not do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, for you did not withhold your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham lifted his eyes and saw, and look, a ram, one, was caught in a thicket by its horns. And Abraham went, and he took the ram, and he offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of that place Yahweh Yireh, as it is said today, "On the mountain of Yahweh it will be provided." And the angel of Yahweh called out to Abraham a second time from the heavens, "By myself I swear, says Yahweh, that because you have done this thing and you did not withhold your son, your only son, that I will surely bless you, and I will greatly multiply your descendants like the stars of the heaven or the grains of the sand on the seashore. And your descendants will take over the stronghold of their enemies, and by your offspring they shall bless themselves, all the nations of the earth, because you heard my voice. So Abraham returned to his lads, and they started out together for Beersheba, and Abraham dwelt at Beersheba. It's an emotional story, right? And you can feel it as it would be read. So I don't know what time it is. Is it close to 7? Is it 7? It's after 7? Okay, then you might not have time, but what I would like you to do is, if you get the chance, and maybe on your way out, and maybe in your prayers and in your thoughts, to think about the complexities of this story, the challenges of this story, and the grace of this story. Because sometimes things in life have all of those. And this might be a good example of that. So we're going to end tonight. If you have a question, you're welcome to come up and talk to me afterwards. And for next week, we're going to read and discuss Genesis chapters 24 through 27. And I encourage you, submit those questions. I'm interested to see what you're thinking about this week.